Hi, welcome to all of you. I'm Ruth McCambridge of the Nonprofit Quarterly, and we're going to spend about an hour together talking about the thrills and spills of nonprofit management. And to guide us through that funhouse is one of the more astute financial observers in the sector, Kate Barr, who's with the Nonprofit Assistance Fund of Minnesota. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Ruth. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. And I want to welcome also each of you who are participating in the session. And I want to ask you to please feel free during the first part of the webinar where I'm talking to Kate to come up with your own questions and just log them on the right-hand side of your screen where you can write out your own questions. The webinar today is free because it's sponsored by Intact, a cloud financial management company specializing in finance and accounting. It's in use by more than 7,300 organizations from startups to public companies. During this discussion, we may be referencing articles that if I'm to judge from previous webinars, what happens is that you immediately start asking us to repeat the title of the article that we just referenced. So we will not repeat the article, the name of the articles, but we will send you every article we've referenced after the webinar if you have logged in for the session. So now let's get down to business. And again, Kate is the head of the Nonprofit Assistance Fund, and some of what they do is administer loans to nonprofits, and that means she has to look at nonprofits when they're in need, in all kinds of states of need. So she's gotten very used to what you see when an organization has experienced some financial difficulties, and besides that, she's kind of a nerd. She follows the stuff in the news to the extent that I do, and I'm I am always looking for stories about what it is that nonprofits are doing financially. So I wanted to start with the very most kind of basic situation, Kate. And let's talk about the group called Oceans Alaska that recently got into some hot water for their use of a $50,000 grant that was supposed to be used for a business plan, basically for operating income. The grant had actually come from an organization that had also given them a $338,000 grant just for basic operating. So could you talk a little bit about what that story can teach us?
Sure, Ruth. It is unfortunately a story that we have seen before, and I think it's also one of the ones that's most avoidable. And as we go through our conversation today, we'll see that there are a couple of themes that are going to continue to emerge, and one of the first ones, which I think this represents, is just the idea of competence around financial accounting. Just kind of some very basic bread and butter skills and experience, knowing how to keep track of things. You know, that those grants that are for a specific purpose are a very unique requirement in terms of accounting, and you got to keep track of it. And it is easy for organizations, especially small ones that expand. You get this new opportunity, you accept the grant, you're very excited, and it is your full intention to actually fulfill on it, but somehow it slips through the cracks and you're just not keeping track of it right. And it is sadly one of the things that we do see. It's also, however, one of the most correctable, and it really is about having someone either on staff or outsourced who is skilled and knows how to do accounting. Very basic.
So you're suggesting that this was a fairly small, very new organization, and what you're suggesting is that one of the things that organizations like that might want to consider is not actually hiring somebody to do the finances, but outsourcing that instead.
Yeah, I think it's always worth considering, especially when you think about financial record keeping and accounting. There are really three different levels that you need. One is that very transactional, keeping the books, writing things down either in a checkbook or in some sort of a software. And then there's the analysis and the figuring out what's happening and whether or not you're on track. And then there's the big strategic decisions. And those are three very different experiences and expertise. And small organizations rarely really either have enough work or can afford, frankly, to hire the higher level. And you can either get that in a really skilled board treasurer, or you can outsource it. And fortunately, there are people, you don't even have to have them in your local community. A small organization like this in Alaska might not have had people right there in, I think it was in Ketchikan, not necessarily right there, but they can certainly hire them from somewhere else.
What's the potential fallout from that kind of situation?
Well, the fallout from that situation is going to, of course, I'm going to say it depends a lot through this hour. It's going to depend a lot on the relationship with that particular source of funding. So if it's a really good relationship and the source of funding is open to maybe understanding a different way of using those other funds, it may be correctable. But it also can damage a relationship to the point of no repair, particularly, in a way, all of these situations that we talk about. Part of the story is how did they get there. Part of the other story is how do they recover, what are the options for recovery. And part of it is recognizing as soon as you identify what happened and that there's a problem, to step forward and do something about it instead of, it's always the cover-up, isn't it? It's always the hiding it and the denial. Same thing here, just like in politics. So.
Right. Okay. You know that in the past year we have done so many newswires about organizations that find themselves in serious financial problems, and the boards are expressing great shock over the state of the finances. But it's pretty clear that you should have been able to pick up what was going on probably 2-3 years ahead of time. So recently we heard about a center that had billed the feds for about $5 million, overbilled the feds for about $5 million. And it was very curious because their patient stats were the same. Somebody should have picked it up. And the fact is that everybody was feeling just great because their revenue looked so good, but they ended up actually having to pay back that the $5 million on a very ambitious schedule. What should have been the yellow flags in a situation like that? What do you think occurs? And this group was not a new organization. It was an organization been around for a while and certainly knew about contracting. What is it that you think needs to happen in situations like this for things to be identified earlier?
Well, this particular story, while I don't know, of course, all the details internally, but it covers the whole gamut of every possible thing that could go wrong, doesn't it? Because it has to do with accounting and very basic operational things in terms of not doing it right. And then can you imagine all the missed signals in terms of the reporting and the connecting the dots? So I think that one of the things that is part of this is that whether or not this organization had a long experience with this particular contracting or whether this was new, there have been, over time, the types of funding and the types of contracting, the types of sources that they have, whether it's state or federal, may have gotten more complex and required additional compliance requirements that they never stepped up to, that they never really built the systems for. I've certainly seen organizations where it was kind of the Peter Principle in action, where someone had risen to a position of authority in finance, a CFO, where they really don't have those skills. But one of the other things that I think that this is evidence, the fact that the patient stats and the financials were not really, they didn't sync up. But oftentimes, unfortunately, we don't look at the financial numbers and the operational programmatic numbers together. And they have to be together. In fact, the best financial strategy always understands that they're integrated together. And so when we pull finance out and think that that's over here on the side, and then we think about our patients or our outcomes differently, we can't pull them apart. They're so connected to each other, both for good and ill. So I
Mhm.
think that there are all kinds of signs probably, and it could have gotten to a point of denial. Once you get to the point where you have $5 million worth of billings or more, you should have a certain amount of double checks and internal controls and maybe even internal audit. So there's so many levels where this went wrong.
Well, it's interesting because I just want to go off script for a minute and say that this particular organization had a series of leadership transitions.
Yep.
Um, previous to this happening. Can you talk a little bit? Because I've noticed that in some cases, when we look at these really, kind of epic fails, that very often you will have seen either a very recent leadership transition or a number of them. Can you talk a little bit about why that may be?
Well, sometimes it's a matter of, is that the cause of the symptom, or is that, it's the correlation and causation, because all of those leadership changes may well be simply evidence of all kinds of other organizational turmoil that might have been at the board level, it could have been at the staff level, it could have been at the community level, and all of that then causes turmoil. So here's one of the other recurring themes through this is who steps forward? Who's the change agent who steps forward, oftentimes on the board, sometimes though in a senior leadership role, and
Mhm.
says, this isn't right, the emperor has no clothes, we have to do something differently, and then digs in to figure it out. But too often, nobody really sees that as their responsibility. They think someone else is taking care of that. It's one of the kind of complications of the governance structure of nonprofits where you have that board and executive leadership where they both have levels of authority. Neither of them have all of the control, but if they don't completely sync up, then really nobody has control.
Right. Yeah. Um, okay, so how do you think, and I don't want to belabor this, but I do think it's important. I think in a lot of cases, organizations, boards of organizations will not be particularly financially literate.
Mm-hmm.
And that they don't have necessarily the skills on the board to be able to catch situations like this. What's your recommendations for establishing that kind of literacy or establishing reporting which is so clear about when you might have a problem formulaically that the board really can't miss the warning signs?
I think that there's a range, because sometimes it's that you truly do not have anyone on the board, or don't have more than one person on the board who actually has some basic financial literacy around reading financial statements, understanding what they're telling us. Often, though, what we see is it's actually a much broader question, which is that you might have some very, very talented business people, bankers, CPAs on the board, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they understand that particular nonprofit's financial situation,
Right.
because nonprofits actually have unbelievably complicated financial situations with all the different sources of revenue and the costs and the allocations and all of that. And so understanding how to read, a business person understanding how to read their profit and loss statement is not the same as a business person knowing how to interpret a health center's financial statement with federal contracts and reimbursements. And so part of it has to do with taking the time and understanding that it really is worth the board study and the board kind of tutorial to actually understand, the business model of this particular organization that is different from, my architecture firm that I run during the day and the community health center that I'm on the board of. Those are completely different animals. And
Mm-hmm.
so even if I'm a savvy business person, I don't necessarily understand that finance. But then one of the other things that happens is that each individual board member doesn't necessarily think that it's their personal responsibility to actually have that technical know-how. And in a way, ideally, we wish they didn't have to, but they really do. They really do have to understand those key levers. What the overbilling the 5 million, I mean, there is a point where when things are too good to be true, you got to ask the question.
Exactly, and what was confounding about that particular situation is it was the feds who caught it and not the organization. It kind of
Right.
came at them as a complete surprise.
Right.
And so it was pretty disturbing, I think, for them. And but they actually managed to work their way out of it, which not all can do.
Right.
Anyway, talking about red and yellow flags, you recently posted something yourself on your site about the YWCA of the Greater Triangle, where you said there were a series of signals missed by the board. Can you describe that situation?
Yeah, that was a story that was in the newswire a little while ago, probably over a year ago, but the organization failed, unfortunately, and the story read that the board members were surprised to discover that the problem was so severe, where it really didn't take a lot of digging and no forensic accounting at all to go back and see that they had had deficits year after year after year. So the signs were so clear, and so we wrote a post called why boards miss the red flags, and part of the reason sometimes is that they don't want to see them. I mean, I hate to say this because I think that boards generally always have the right intention, but if you do catch the red flags, then it kind of mandates that you do something about it, and that's hard. And so sometimes they look the other way, or will kind of be fed an easy line that says, well, it'll all be better, with year-end fundraising or the gala, or we'll get this new grant, or we're going to hire a new development director, or kind of a various series of kind of wishful thinking. And it sounds like a solution, and so the board members say, great, that'll take care of it. And again, it's the same thing about who becomes the change agent and steps forward and saying, no, we really actually have to do something differently.
Mm-hmm. I find that whole area so interesting, and you and I have talked about this before, just the, how to recognize when a reasonable level of risk has moved over the cliff into a kind of a foolhardiness.
Right.
That really puts the organization in danger, and I think it's sometimes hard for people to call that moment.
It is, and I agree. It's that, where do you step from reasonable risk-taking to wishful thinking and la-la land? And I think that I think one of the things that sometimes constrains us is that we too often think that the annual budget is the end-all and be-all of financial planning and is the best financial planning tool we have because it's the one that's most common. And so if we think entirely in one-year increments, then it's hard to get past wishful thinking, because otherwise how could you ever either grow or recover? And so one of the very specific tactics that helps you move past that is to always think in 3-year increments financially. Because when you get into that wishful thinking, the question is, well, we'll hire a development director. Is that wishful thinking, or is that actually a really reasonable strategy? If you're thinking of it in a 12-month period of time, it's probably wishful thinking. If you're thinking 3 years, it actually might be a reasonable strategy. But then you have to actually know what are your benchmarks, what are the triggers, how much are you going to invest, so that you're actually making a prudent risk rather than oh, we hope so.
Right. And I remember talking to a woman years ago, right as the recession was getting started, who was running an organization called the San Jose Repertory Theater, which is no more. It went under a few weeks ago, finally. But she described to me in very great detail the extent to which every single show that they staged was a serious financial risk for them. Mm-hmm. And so I think arts organizations are in a kind of a unique situation in some ways because they have such odd, moments of capital investment. And can you talk a little bit, because we know you talked earlier about there being business models, that you need to pay attention to the specific business models and how that business model basically needs to be fed to function properly, right? And for a lot of performance arts organizations, there is a need to feed capital into them in one way and another that can sometimes be fairly disastrous if your speculations or your predictions don't work out. Can you talk just a little bit about maybe some of the special needs of arts organizations?
Yeah, I can. We actually work with quite a lot of theaters, in particular performing arts organizations here in the Twin Cities. The performing arts organizations do have a really tough business model, and part of it has to do with a fairly intense capital investment, especially if they own a building. But even if they don't own a building, simply the cost of production, which is all sunk cost. You pay it all up front, and then you present a season, you present a show, and people buy tickets. There are also some important changes happening demographically in terms of how people engage with performing arts, both in terms of the aging and the diversity of the community, but also just behavior. So the old subscriber model of buying a season ticket is actually really shifting to much more shorter term. I want to decide today to go to a show, so then it's even more risky because ticket sales come so late. One of the things I know that happened with San Jose Rep also is that they had done all kinds of really smart, tough decisions about their financial structure, and then they had a couple of they didn't have a lot of wiggle room, they didn't have a lot of elbow room and reserves, and then the city made some changes in their funding really because of some things that happened at the state level, and it just cascaded down on them so that it kind of became the last straw. And there is, particularly in the last couple of years as we've been crawling out of the recession, is not just arts organizations, but lots of organizations really dug into their reserves in that 2008, 9, and 10. And so if you're kind of depleted and so you can't really absorb anything, you're so close to the bone that something pushes you over the edge. If you had some reserves, which maybe you had 6 years ago, you could have absorbed that city change or contract change or a bad night at the gala. One of the things that happens in the arts, though, is that different organizations do tend to have a different kind of a risk level, risk tolerance. Arts organizations kind of within the culture of that part of the sector are more risk tolerant, certainly than most social service and healthcare organizations. So there is somewhat of a higher tolerance for risk.
Right.
And there's a long history of kind of fantastic things happening and turning out well.
Right.
And so you kind of continue to look for that.
It's such an interesting situation because you see the way that it really affects even the program model, because she talked a lot about not wanting to be a roadhouse, wanting to stage their own original material, and it very much affects your program model, your business model affects that, and the variables in that business model can change on you, as they have for arts organizations.
Right, absolutely. And in particular, right now there's story after story after story about both orchestras and operas, because those are two parts of the performing arts sector where everything is changing. They have high fixed costs, they have very deep institutional roots where they are loyal to certain both artistic and audience groups, and yet the world is changing, the costs are going up, audiences are really changing radically, and we've seen story after story after story of quote unquote the business model is broken, and it is. And some of the solution is going to be radically different than we're going to find a new endowment fund. Right. Some of it's going to actually end up with different production, and some organizations will actually end up either closing or really transitioning into a completely different kind of an organization, including maybe even a roadhouse. I mean, that is not her vision, and I understand that, but sometimes it's going to be really different than what we think it is.
Right. So let's move back into the area of human services for a minute and talk a little bit about Hull House, which is one of the most distressing failures I think we've seen in the last few years. Can you talk some about what happened there and what could have gone differently?
Well, the story of Hull House in Chicago, which closed in 2012 after, an iconic storied history from Jane Addams' days, it's such a sad tale, and it would take us a whole day to tell the whole story because it is such a complicated question of organizational culture and over-reliance on government funding to pay for things that probably were, you get $1 and it costs you $1.50 to do, which is one of the really systemic and structural problems within a lot of social services. And then there was just unbelievable denial going on. The Hull House story, so they ultimately closed after just having recurring deficits for years, really and truly for years, deficit after deficit after deficit. They also had a severely underfunded pension fund, again, long-term organization, that then just kind of mushroomed up on them so that it overwhelmed them. They had a lot of debt, they owned a lot of buildings, and my impression from what I've read is that they essentially lost the confidence of any one of their stakeholders. It also appears from all of the reading that I did, and I hate to admit it, but I read every word about Hull House because it's like, what can we learn here? Is that there's the other story that is really unfortunate recently was the failure of the New York City Opera, right, which also, long story, a lot of deficits, but I pulled quotes from both of them because both stories had one thing in common that I think is really important. So here are the two quotes. This one's from the Hull House. Former executive director said this. This was in some article I read. It said, "We were very used to social service agencies always being on the brink of destruction, and some of the board members didn't get the idea of living on the edge." And then the quote from the New York City Opera story was that one of the former performers said, "There was always a shoestring aspect to it. In some ways, it's what made it exciting." Yeah. So when you identify with that kind of an organizational culture that says, well, we're a nonprofit, it's better for us to just always be slightly starving, always be looking for the next, box of ramen noodles, you will never have any kind of a cushion, but that's not a financial strategy. That's not a business model. That's just asking for it. And when you're a small little organization with 4 volunteers, you can do that. But when you're an institution with buildings and endowment and contracts and pensions, you can't do that. You can't do that. And so if there's that kind of a cultural thing, I don't know how to get over that without a really significant change agent coming in, making everybody mad and changing it all.
Right. And it does make people
mad. Yeah, it does make people mad. Yeah, right. Right.
Well, can we go back for a minute and just talk about fixed costs versus variable costs, and just people kind of not understanding what it means when you in fact invest in a building, and the kinds of vulnerabilities that it causes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I absolutely can, and I always talk about this on the shoulders of Clara Miller, who has written a lot of things for the Quarterly about this whole idea of capitalization and capital structures for nonprofits. She absolutely set the stage for this, and I know that there are some articles that you'll post probably about this. But one of the idea of a business model, let's just talk about the idea of a business model. I believe that the business model of a nonprofit has really 4 interrelated components: the revenue that you have, the cost of doing your work in a way that's effective, the infrastructure that makes the organization work, and the capital structure. And those 4 things connect together like levers, so that you change one, you change them all. Not many things change that more than buying a building, because all of a sudden you've completely changed their capital structure by having all this fixed assets and possibly some debt. But you also now have changed the cost of everything in the organization, because you have this permanent fixed cost that you can't downsize, you can't move, and you need a new source. You need to have reliable revenue so that you can feed that beast. You feed the hungry teenager. And so all of a sudden, everything changed. You have new infrastructure. So whenever you make one of these really kind of radical changes to your business model, like buying a building, it changes everything else. And again, in that short-term thinking, the excitement of a capital campaign, the excitement of won't it be cool when we have this building, not thinking long-term enough about how this is going to change everything else about our organization. And especially capital campaigns were tough between 2008 and 2012, especially. Too many times capital campaigns were only partially successful, and then the part that was underfunded was the kind of the operating funds, the building reserves, being able to really cover the depreciation. And then all of a sudden the organization is weaker. Isn't it ironic that you raise $5 million and you end up worse off financially? Even though you just raised $5 million. And so having a building...
Ironic and very painful.
Right, yeah. So for many organizations, owning a building is the exactly right decision to make, but you can't overplan. You can't rush into it. One of the building things that happens to organizations that's another kind of unexpected damage is someone donates a building to you. Here, we're going to give you a building. I mean, what a gift. But sometimes that's really damaging as well. So that decision to own a building, you need to have everything else has to be solid beforehand. Have some operating reserves, have some cash flow, make sure that your other revenue, that your programs are covered, because buying a building changes everything, and anyone who's ever gone through it will agree.
Right. One of the things that is much more common, at least in nonprofit organizations than in other kinds of organizations, is the existence of restricted funds. And this actually causes quite a problem for a lot of organizations. Can you talk a little bit about how the existence of too much in restricted funds in your budget can cause problems for your organization?
Yeah, restricted funds are this really unique thing about nonprofit accounting, and this picks up on the idea of financial management competence and skills, about boards' financial literacy and leadership's financial literacy, and then just plain good financial management practices. So restricted funds, funds come in, grants or individual donations or capital campaign for a specific purpose, they get counted as revenue in the year that they're received. That's the accounting rule. And so here we receive a $500,000 grant. Look at that, we have all this revenue, but it's for a specific purpose. And so a number of things happen. One is that even if we account for it accurately, when you read a financial audit or a financial statement from a nonprofit, there's a column that says unrestricted, a column that says temporarily restricted, and then that column that says total. Well, naturally, you look at the total and think that's the number, where actually, in a way, that's the least useful information. So if you take the restricted out, you may see that there's a deficit, or that, wow, we just plugged a hole once but can't recreate that. So one of the things that happens with restricted funds is, part of it's the Alaska example that you started with, using them for something else. That actually doesn't happen as often as just the fact that restricted funds, because they come in these kind of lumpy amounts, will mask other problems.
Right.
Probably the most damaging are when you're doing a capital campaign or some sort of non-operating funding, and that masks the structural deficits of the operations. And I've certainly seen that happen where over a couple of years of a capital campaign, the organization is also just plain losing money on their programs, but you can't really see it. So I can't believe I'm going to say this, but having accurate accounting records doesn't always give you the most useful management information. You really have to pull it apart. You have to pull it apart. One of the other things that does happen with restricted funds is if you just don't keep track of it right. We encourage organizations to always, no matter who they are, no matter how much it is, to make sure that at least once a quarter they're making sure that they're kind of reconciling what should they be counting, what shouldn't they. But too many organizations wait until the end of the year. They say, I'm going to let the auditor take care of it. But then you're in for a surprise.
Right. Okay, I want to, this is actually, I know, one of your favorite topics, and I don't want to pick on health centers, but the other day we wrote a newswire about a health center, which is actually 44 years old enough to know better, and it now has a lien placed against it for almost $500,000 for unpaid payroll taxes. And the unpaid payroll taxes stretch back to 2012. It just went under recently, which is kind of a disaster. At the point that the lien was placed against it, they were about to get a $2 million donation for a building, for a new site that they were creating. And of course, with that lien on them, there's no way in the world that grant is now going to be made, and eventually the organization just closed. This is just about a week ago. Can we talk a little bit about the practice of not paying your payroll taxes, how common it is, what it causes, in terms of, kind of reputational damage as well as other kinds of damage? Just go for it.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is sadly one of my favorite topics to talk about because we do see it several times a year here, and I know it happens multiple times around the country. It's what I have absolutely called the worst financial decision ever. Because here's what happens is that if an organization is having cash flow problems and they can't pay all of their bills, what happens is that the vendors, the creditors that call and hassle you, get paid. And so some company that sells you office supplies or sells you an office, equipment calls and calls and calls and says, why don't you pay? And so the bookkeeper accountant pays them because that's really annoying. You know who doesn't call? The IRS doesn't call and say you haven't paid payroll taxes. And so then it just mushrooms, and it's a sad story where, well, we'll pay it next week, and then next week you don't, and then we'll pay it next month, and then it starts to really snowball up, and then you start to get penalties. Having it go back 2 years, though, I don't know the specifics of this story, but someone knew and knew it, but then it gets so overwhelming, you don't know what to do about it. You're ashamed, it's embarrassing, all of that, and it was in denial. So my guess, I can't believe that a financial audit wouldn't have a footnote that said that. The footnotes to the financial audit are the most useful part of that document. Frankly, a good auditor would have said it to the board audit committee. I always encourage the board audit committee or board having an executive session with the auditor to say, is there anything we should know? But that's not always the case. I think I've told you, Ruth, that essentially my entire career was launched because I was the receptionist at a performing arts organization when I was like 22 years old, and they hadn't paid their payroll taxes. And when the board found out, they laid off all the staff and asked me and one other person if we could please continue just so they could keep the doors open, and I ended up as business manager. Now, first of all, totally unqualified, just happened that way. But in a way, my whole career was started because of both the worst financial decision ever, but also one of the best governance steps ever, which is the board, once they found out about it, they took immediate action. They said, stop. This now it becomes the priority. And if they hadn't done that, that organization would have been in that same snowballing. So, normally we don't ask the boards to do very specific, show me your payroll taxes. There may be situations where that's probably what they need to do, but certainly someone knew that was happening and let it happen.
Right. Okay, I'm going to go to a couple of the questions from the participants now, and I'm going to start with one from Pam Curtis, who asks, how would you recommend that an executive encourage the board to move its focus off short-term saving measures and onto a multi-year financial strategy?
First of all, I'm glad that she wants to do that because that's one of the most important things, is shifting from that short term to longer term. One of the other things that I've said sometimes about why boards miss the red flags is because they focus so much on that short-term information. And part of it's that the most understandable financial report we ever give a board is the financial report of income and expense compared to budget, because it makes sense to everyone. And so then when we overemphasize that at the board, and so the board goes through it, whether they're going through line by line or just generally, again, that's very short term. Too often boards don't look at, frankly, the balance sheet. And even if I don't get you caught up in accounting, they don't think about the long-term financial health of the organization, which is represented in, unrestricted net assets, cash reserves, things like that. So one thing that she can do, or that an executive can do, is simply introduce that idea of multi-year financial planning. So the annual budget is always presented accompanied by, here's our executive summary forecast for the next 2 years, but always bringing in those longer term questions rather than dwelling too much on that short term.
Mm-hmm. So taking it out of the immediate.
Yeah.
And being able to watch the larger strategy,
right, right, and to look at trends, and to look at multi-year going backwards, even historically. So rather than just look at the year end and say, how did we do compared to our budget, but then actually do a quick little spreadsheet of the last 3 years and say, so what's different? Do we have a similar type of revenue, or have we had a lot of volatility? Because those are the yellow flags. Those are the indicators. That little short term, all it is it's such a quick view versus thinking either historically or in a forecast.
There's another question here of basically, what is it that should be included in an orientation for the board? How long should it take? How should it be done? Should it be done over a number of sessions or in one session? What are the expectations for creating a core of financial literacy in the board? What should it take us?
I think that the board orientation, which I think is a great tool that most well-run organizations do, the question of the orientation, I think that has a specific function in terms of helping the board members get to know the organization. The question about the financial, other than here's the reports and here's what they mean, here's what they say, I think learning an organization's business model, which is the longer term question, that takes longer. That's probably going to take any individual board member a few board meetings and maybe some tutorial from the board treasurer, the finance committee, to really learn it, and for everyone to kind of have a common language around that. So I don't think that you can really get to the absolute complete understanding of the financial picture in an orientation session, because it's so built on what the organization does. So I think that it's a cumulative, but I think we do have to accumulate it. We have to encourage it and provide that all the time.
Do you think that people know how to communicate their business models to their board for the most part?
No, probably not. And in a way, it would be useful. Wouldn't it be interesting to put together a quick little 4-article primer from Nonprofit Quarterly? I would start with every board member should read John Pratt's article about the autonomy and reliability of income, because it is such a revealing article about the question about how income is so different in the nonprofit sector than in the for-profit sector. So there probably maybe 4 articles that could be kind of the quick, your board members should read this.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back to some of my questions now, and I want to go to the issue of fraud and the prevention of fraud. So we agreed that we would bring to this conversation the case of the Gloria Wise Boys and Girls Club, which was probably one of the longest running fraud situations that I've ever seen. But could you describe exactly what was going on in that organization for people?
So the Gloria Wise Boys and Girls Club was probably the worst atrocity of fraud that either one of us and anyone has ever read, because it was absolutely organizational culture, systemic within the organization at the highest level of senior leadership, basically just larceny. Ongoing, people that, record keeping, fraudulent reporting, fraudulent billing, and then just self benefiting themselves. So it's kind of the worst possible case. The question, though, I think that we can learn from Gloria Wise Boys and Girls Club, and there's a great article about it, is really, so since most of us will never have anything this bad, the question is, so what were the signs, and who should have taken action? Ultimately, like with most fraud, that was not found by an auditor. I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that financial audit rarely actually catches fraud. Fraud is almost always a whistleblower, almost always an internal whistleblower. And that was the case with Gloria Wise Boys and Girls Club, where an internal staff member called the city and said, you got to know what's going on here, because that's where a lot of the problems were with the city funding. So part of it is, of course, just having stinky organizational leadership that essentially encourages this. But part of it also is clearly the auditors were not doing their job, even to at least say, boy, we don't even know where the documentation is for this. And the board was probably, I don't remember, but isolated from the staff, so that when you have that strong executive leadership that keeps everyone back from the staff, from the board, and nobody can talk about it, so that everything funnels through them, that is not necessarily a sign of fraud, but it's always kind of a dangerous thing, because then you're so reliant on that one person for information, for understanding, for kind of having open eyes and understanding when things change. Mm-hmm. Most fraud is much more isolated in an individual person or a couple of people in the organization. And just like everything, the question is, as soon as you identify it, to dig in, to find it, and then to do something about it, to take action and not to overlook it. We are occasionally asked for referrals for forensic accountants. It's a really specialized skill, but can be unbelievably helpful to very quickly go in and figure out what's going on.
Yeah. And if you have this kind of a mind, it's much better than reading murder mysteries. Just go with other people's forensics.
It's true. It's true.
Because, boy, it will give you a series of warnings about what not to do.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. It is worth saying also that a lot of fraud is really committed by people who you would least expect to commit the fraud. There are people who are extremely well trusted by the organization, and because they're so trusted, there tends to be a kind of a lesser, level of observation of them.
Right. Right.
So if you have, this is the reason for checks and balances, if you have a financial person, chief financial officer, who is not being checked by anybody else, if you have a bookkeeper or really anybody handling money who does not have a check on them, you're opening yourself up for vulnerability for fraud. And it's not, I think the other thing that's worth saying is, you're as sick as your secrets. At the point that you understand that something has gone awry in your financial systems, it really is best to try to face up to that, is to the greatest degree possible.
Right. And to be honest about it, there are a couple of situations where fraud was found in an organization, but they internally decided to keep it quiet and cover it up because they thought it would damage their reputation. Where I think that we now have enough cases to prove that actually being open and transparent about it. There are a couple of stories I can think of where an organization was very public and said, we discovered this, here's what we've done, and frankly their reputation was strengthened by that transparency.
Right. I think that's really true, but you really have to bold it out and apologize. Make sure that people understand that you understand what exactly happened, so that they're convinced that you will not do it again. Mm-hmm. Here's another question from a participant. I'm a new board member trying to move the board to having a financial review at every meeting. What are some helpful financial questions to share with the ED and board to get them to make this a priority and start thinking strategically about the future?
Well, first of all, I'm glad to know that you want to have financial review at every meeting because I do agree that it's important. I don't think that the financial information is actually the most important thing at most board meetings. So even though I'm a finance person, I think it always has to be in context of the organization. So that's why it is helpful to have a kind of a standard report, whether it's a official dashboard report or something else, but where some people with some knowledge and understanding of the business model have identified those 5 or 6 kind of key pieces of information that really tell you what's the pulse of the organization, both short-term and long-term, and then have some sort of a reporting of them. One of the other things I think that it's important to help board members do is for everyone to kind of get comfortable and gain some confidence about what to do with financial information. Even when we give board members financial information, if they don't know what they're supposed to do with it,
Right.
it might as well not be there. And there are some pretty simple questions, such as, is this what I expected to see? Does this make sense based on my understanding of the organization? And then maybe a question for every meeting really to kind of focus in on, like, what's changing in our contributed income? Or how reliable is our our employee costs, what we expect them to be. So maybe digging into one question at each meeting.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the other things that a board member can do, like our participant, is simply say, I'm a board member and I want this to happen, and this is a responsibility of the board, so let's do it.
Right. So I would feel not thorough enough if I didn't address this. We see over and over again problems with conflicts of interest between board members and staff members in organizations, and this is where we see a lot of problems of fraud occurring. Can you talk a little bit about the need to create some separations and what those separations should be, when people need to be careful about conflicts?
Well, I think that why conflicts of interest are important is pretty obvious, and now is so. I think it's become more institutionalized in the sector that every nonprofit should have a conflict of interest policy that covers both board and staff, and that everyone should read it once a year and sign off on it. I think one of the interesting things I think that happens is that maybe it's the word conflict, but it's seen as this huge negative, so we want to avoid them, and so let's not talk about them. Mm-hmm. Rather than being seen as, well, this is just a normal, ordinary course of business, they are inevitably going to happen, and the important thing is just that we have a process. And so for a board member to say, I have a conflict of interest on this decision and so I should step out of it, should be seen as a positive, not as some sort of shameful, embarrassing thing. And I do think that that's kind of one of the mindsets that happens. But when they do happen, here's another one. I mean, so many of these cautionary tales come back to a leadership question, whether it's organizational or individual, for someone to say, that's not right, that's just not okay. I served on a board that had a fair number of conflicts of interest that made perfect sense because of the composition. Mm-hmm. And it really helped for us to actually just put it on the agenda every meeting because they were so common to make it normal. We normalized it. So what are the conflicts this time? Oh, well, I have one. Then it was kind of a no big deal. One of the conflicts that I just want to bring up because I see it happening, and it's kind of this little, it kind of creeps up on you. It's when an organization does have kind of a problem, and so a board member makes a loan to the organization to solve the problem, to plug the hole. On the one hand, that sounds kind of like, what a great board member, they're helping us solve the problem. What happens though, as soon as a board member becomes a creditor, the relationship is different. And I've seen a couple of situations where it got pretty deep, so it was several $100,000, mm-hmm. and all of a sudden you have this board member sitting in a governance role, but they have such a complete conflict of interest because their self-interest is to get themselves repaid, not to actually make the organization work. And so it's those little dangerous it's the dangerous ones that start out as really seeming positive but end up incredibly damaging.
Right. one more situational issue. We just wrote something the other day about a couple of organizations who had people die. In one case, it was a board member, the board chair, who had all of the funding contacts. And in the other case, it was an ongoing living donor who was giving the organization $10,000 a year. It was a very small organization. In both cases, it really put the entire future of the organization into question. Can you talk about that in kind of a larger sense in terms of just putting all your eggs in one basket or putting too many of your eggs in one basket? And I know you have a kind of a nuanced view about that.
Well,
About that?
I do have a nuanced view, because I think that the question about having, the big picture kind of quote-unquote best practice is that nonprofits should have a diverse sources of revenue so that they're not overly reliant. The reality is that that's actually unbelievably hard to do, to have a perfectly balanced, diverse types of revenue, because they all take such different structures and relationships and types of services to do. So almost every nonprofit has some sort of a reliance. The question is, how dangerous is that reliance? And so, for a health center, for a well-run health center, a reliance on the federal government is not really all that dangerous, as long as you have good systems and deliver high quality care and follow all the rules. It's not really particularly dangerous as long as you're paying attention. For the small organizations that had the single donor,
Start, though.
well, exactly. I mean, part of it is a question.
Sequestration. I mean, that was a disaster for Head Start.
Right. And so there is that question that there's certain things you don't have control over. And one of the quotes I love is the old robber baron Andrew Carnegie, who said, put all your eggs in one basket and then watch that basket. And so part of it is, if you do have reliance on government funds, you have to be really plugged into what's happening at the policy level, the political level, so that you see, if for nonprofits that are reliable on CDBG funding, they hopefully have been watching for 3 years while CDBG has been really being debated and eroded and discussed, so that they could anticipate it. You can't necessarily fix it, but at least it doesn't come as a surprise.
Right.
Now, if you have a major living donor who dies suddenly at a young age, that's one of those out of the blue things that you really can't be particularly prepared for, and every organization is vulnerable to something. It's all about how you respond to it. Sometimes the best response to something is not to necessarily say, well, there's nothing we can do about it, but to actually intentionally shrink your organization and say, we're going to have to be smaller.
Right.
Yeah. One thing that we haven't really talked about, and I want to be sure we run out of time, I want to be sure to mention, which is ultimately the most common cause of really financial problems is persistent deficits. It's what's that phrase is that structural deficits. It's that it's not a one-time thing, it's not a surprise, but frankly you just have more expenses than you do income, more cash going out than you have coming in, and if you overlook it year after year after year, it's not uncommon to have a deficit every now and then, but when it happens time after time after time, and the plugging in the budget doesn't fix it, that is almost always what ultimately causes these problems, because then you get in the hole and don't pay your payroll taxes or overbill or do something, but it's those structural deficits that really underlie almost every one of them.
Right, and I thought during the recession it was interesting because people didn't know when that was going to end, and so they were attributing what looked at some point like a structural deficit to a particular period in time that they didn't know what the end of that was.
Exactly.
For some organizations that hasn't ended, not yet, and maybe not forever, but for some organizations it did end, and so it was a flyer. A lot of organizations took.
Right.
Very quickly, Kate, can you just talk quickly about what's the difference between an organization that can recover from a serious financial mess and one that can't? What do you think are the variables that make one organization more resilient, hardy than another?
Well, not surprisingly, it's all about leadership, and it's often at the executive level, sometimes at the board level, and often a combination of it may be a new person, it may be someone who steps forward who is willing to both ask the right questions and then take action and not be popular, because oftentimes that taking action is not a popular thing. And again, it's a matter of, do you save the short term or the long term? During the recession, it was so painful, it was so difficult for so many organizations. But when we talked to directors, and they would say, well, our top priority is preserving our employees' jobs, that is, unfortunately, I hate to say it, not the right priority. The right priority has to be, our top priority is making sure that the community is served or that our mission is advanced. And sometimes really, really hard things have to be done. Truths have to be spoken, questions have to be asked, and so in every case, the ones that recover have had a great leader that stepped forward and did unbelievably hard work. There's often leadership transition, frankly, when there's really, really bad problems. There's often the executive will leave, maybe a great interim will be brought in, or a great change agent will come in who will just be different.
Right. Not so attached to what is.
What is or what was, exactly. Yeah, right, yeah.
The
The one kind of, we were talking about how to avoid them as we talked about doing this session. Probably the number one and simple and most accessible to everyone is have good, reliable, competently prepared financial information and know what it's telling you. And then read it, pay attention to it, catch those yellow indicators and do something about it, and don't just think, well, maybe it'll get better later. Really, good quality information that you take action on. Probably 85% of them could be caught earlier, because it's all about, of course, catching it early.
Right. Thank you so much, Kate. This has been wonderful. And thank you, everybody who came. I do want to say to you, I got a number of notes from you saying, please post that article. As I said at the beginning of the session, we will send you out citations for all of the articles that we've mentioned during the session within the next 24 hours or so. Just make sure that you have signed in on the little sign-in form that we gave you. Thank you very much. We hope to see you again at another one of these sessions. And as always, Kate, it's a pleasure working with you.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Okay.